our final speaker today, and thank you everybody for staying, and we will have time for questions. Actually, that depends on how long Barry talks for it, but
you never
we'll
know.
have plenty of time. I've told all the presenters I'm going to rugby tackle them in 22 minutes. So, Barry is an assistant lecturer in French in DIT and a visiting research assistant in film studies at Trinity College, Dublin. His title is Reframing the Films of Jacques Feyder. Sorry, how do you pronounce it? Is it Jacques Feyder?
You're doing fine, yeah.
Thank you. Despite 6 years of secondary school French education, I'm still a bit dubious about my pronunciations. Domestic Space and the Melodramatic Tradition in Pension Mimosas.
Okay, how many people know about Jacques Feyder? Anybody? No. Yes? Oh, good. Yeah, okay, yeah, I have a point of trying to force this guy down people's throats. Today's the next stage in that long-term project. You all know this man, I hope, or most of you. Yeah, Francois Truffaut. Okay, and he is partly to answer for the reasons why you don't know who Feyder is, I think. I just move swiftly on. I might just turn back the clock first and just take it back to a review from 1934, which was written right before Pension Mimosas, the film in question, the film I'll be analysing today, was released. Described Feyder as one of those whose every film is awaited with feverish excitement, who we fear could not further elevate an art that he has already raised so high, and whose latest work always reveals the pointlessness of such fears. Feyder, two syllables that draw the eyes of so many foreign producers to Paris. And Feyder was entering the most critically acclaimed period of his career, but he had been an established filmmaker since 1921 upon the release of L'Atlantide. Feyder fought on the Isère front during World War I and subsequently worked as a filmmaker at Gaumont. Throughout the 20s, held a number of literary adaptations, including Calment, Pétrarcam, okay. And by the end of the 20s, he was becoming so popular that he was actually featuring on the covers of periodicals whose pictures were generally reserved for stars rather than directors. By now, Feyder was actually becoming very frustrated with the lack of financial resources and technical resources available in France. So he accepted an offer from MGM to go to Hollywood and to help Greta Garbo during the transition to sound, and was promised many lucrative projects. It didn't, as usual with most of these emigre directors, things didn't work out quite as planned. The French newspapers were lamenting his departure. He's going to leave for America, he has left for America, and the papers were still publishing his opinions on talking film during the transition. Feyder, in the meantime, was relegated to foreign language versions of MGM features, which really got worse and worse. I don't want to make too many assumptions, but John Gilbert, anybody? John Gilbert, the classic example of a star who didn't make the transition to sound. Feyder was responsible for making French and German language versions of John Gilbert's material. So you can imagine the kinds of projects that Feyder was faced with. So, rather disgruntled with Hollywood, he returned to France again. By now, Plenard was not a popular director. Carnet would work as assistant director to Feyder for the next 5 years. And Jean Vigo was dead. So we're talking about an environment in which France was crying out for somebody to save its national cinema. Feyder returned, directed 3 films in a row, Le Conjure, Pension Mimosas and La Camus Heroique, which all featured in the top 10 box office successes of the year. Feyder again accepted an offer to leave France. Went to film Night Without Armour for Alexandre Korda. The film was a resounding commercial failure, from which his career never really recovered. He returned to France once more to film Les Gens du Voyage and Le Roi du Nord before the outbreak of World War II, and for the entirety of the war dwelt in Switzerland, where he later died. Now, by the time of his death in 1948, Feyder was still seen as one of the great directors. Bazin equates him with Carnet, Duvivier and Renoir in a lecture he gave in Warsaw in the 1950s, and indeed in Evolution of the Language of Cinema. You'll find Feyder's name in there. However, the critics at Cahiers du Cinema weren't particularly impressed with Feyder's work for 3 big reasons, really. First of all, he relied heavily on source text, on novels. He adapted quite a number of novels over the course of his career, particularly in the 1920s. Secondly, I perhaps didn't give you the time to realise there exactly how diverse the themes covered by Feyder's work, just the incredibly diverse range of material that he covered. Colonial epics, poetic realism, melodrama, which is what I'm focusing on today. Really, Feyder seemed to lack any sort of signature style. Okay. And I'm convinced there was a third reason there. Yes, his extremely heavy reliance on set designers, screenwriters, other technicians. He collaborated numerous times with Lazar Mearson, okay? And also, his assistant director from 1929 to 1935 was Carnet, and that was enough really to offend the critics of Cahiers du Cinema. Just any association with Carnet was a form of social death in itself. And Truffaut wrote this really horrendous, I don't even want to say review, just he criticised Carnet's Eric, his most commercially successful film in the 1950s, the most detestable film, because everything in it is complete. Its bolus is attenuated, it is reasonable, measured, its doors are half opened, the paths are sketched and only sketched. Everything in it is pleasant and perfect. All great films in the history of cinema are failures. I should say that this sort of view of Feyder has persisted since Dudley Andrew wrote a major examination of French cinema in the 30s, but still reduces Feyder to a director of actors, lacking any sort of directorial signature. And Feyder himself, I must say, in his autobiography, he insists that he worked as a craftsman, going from one project to the next without any reflection on the origin and essence of this art. Before we move on to this, today I'm not going to try and discuss Feyder's stylistic signature. I'm still trying to figure out what it even is. But I do think that there are continuities in his work that perhaps don't align with formal, preoccupations that Cahiers du Cinema held in many cases, especially in the case of Renoir, for example. Gender is going to be the core focus of what I'm looking at today. One of the most interesting films of Feyder's corpus, I feel, is Pension Mimosas. I will give you the plot here, actually. So, the story is about Louise and Gaston Noblet, a childless couple co-owning a boarding house in Nice. They take in a young boy, Pierre, whose father has been imprisoned. The father eventually returns to claim his child. 10 years later, Louise receives letters from Pierre, now based in Paris, repeatedly requesting money, which he is using to satisfy the demands of his exploitative girlfriend, Nellie. Louise eventually invites Pierre and Nellie to live in the boarding house. Well, no, Louise invites Pierre and Pierre invites Nellie. Things don't work out quite so well, we'll see that. The remainder of the film examines Louise's efforts to recapture her son's transient innocence and to subliminally express her own romantic longing for her adopted son. And I'll mention further plot details where appropriate. The reason why this film interests me, apart from the curious subject matter, is the fact that a female-centered melodrama was not very common in France in the 1930s. It was Hollywood stock in trade during the 1930s. However, let me take an alternative approach. I mentioned that we're talking here about this sort of quasi-incestuous relationship between a mother and her adopted son. This sort of incestuous circle was common to French cinema of the period, but what we were generally talking about are aging father figures who generally win the hand of a young lady from a much younger and conventionally more attractive male rival. And that's what Jeanette Vanson talks about here. Young women being won from young rivals, by older men. And French cinema largely ignored melodramatic women-centred narratives set in the classic years of women's experience and attempting to tell a story from a woman's point of view or to portray a woman's subjectivity and desire. And women in general in French cinema of the 1930s, which might be hard to imagine for those of us who've watched a lot of Hollywood melodramas of the 30s, think of The Old Maid, Stella Dallas, and the great classics of the period. Women in France, on the other hand, function to facilitate relationships between male characters. And this is my favourite, mothers. Whereas in Hollywood, so many, think of Betty Davis, Joan Crawford, Margaret Sullivan, who all had to prove, all of them really get into the ritual of maternal sacrifice at one point or another during the 30s, whereas mothers in French cinema were generally absent, out of sight, ineffectual, mad or dead. It's great. Just to make sure I stay on track here. I just want to point out before I move on to this film, which goes against the grain in a number of respects, that I'm actually taking a cue from this exhaustive study of French cinema of the 30s. There's a rather throwaway comment in which Noel Birch and Geneviève Sellier say that Feyder and Spack was the co-writer, both individually and together, were used to making family films that approached issues of sexual roles from a critical standpoint. So I do want to point that out. The story itself is the product of an original screenplay by Feyder and Spack, okay? But their portrayal of this relationship between an adoptive mother and her son has a number of literary predecessors, stretching right back to ancient Greek tragedy, specifically Euripides' Hippolytus, which was later adapted by Seneca as Phaedra. Both of these plays portray the adoptive mother's fatal admission of romantic inclinations towards her adopted son in the wake of her husband's death. Apparent death, I should say. It turns out the husband is alive and they all die by the end. Jean Racine's Fed adopts Seneca's overt emphasis on the female viewpoint and adds Aricie, the son's object of affection and Phaedra's rival. Feyder and Spack draw on the Racinian model of the Phaedra myth by foregrounding the perspective of the female protagonist and introducing a love interest for Pierre, albeit one who is a good deal less virtuous than Racine's Aricie. My chief interest today is how Feyder's framing of domestic space expresses anxieties invoked by Louise's relationship with Pierre and by her disapproval towards his relationship with Nelly. Okay, now just to so what I'm really trying to talk about here is melodrama, and I don't have any quotes up here. But my background isn't melodrama, but my approach to it has been informed by the usual suspects: Thomas Elzesser, Christine Bledhill, Jeffrey Noel Smith, who all discuss the home as discuss the home in melodrama as a space in which tensions within the family, tensions that cannot be accommodated by the family unit, are siphoned off through aspects of set design, expressive costumes, highly stylized performances. Okay, and a lot of these tensions generally pertain to class and gender. In much of the film, most of the film centres on the space of the boarding house, and much of the set. Much of the set frames characters in groups in relation to the space of the boarding house. Viewing houses as exclusionary sites where difference registers as deviance, David Sibley writes that thresholds such as hallways and passages, by linking the private with the public, constitute ambiguous zones that compromise domestic space. Such sites proliferate within the Nobles boarding house, which is both a domestic space and a space of business. Distinctions between the public and the private are further problematised by the many windows that structure the boarding house. And what's very interesting about this is that in the beginning, Louise is walking around the upper floor and the lower floor of the boarding house, and we see all these windows, this glass structure which provides the roof of the home. And she's able to keep an eye on Pierre, and she's also able to make sure that her customers are paying before they leave. And even when she's having the private moments with her husband, we constantly remain aware of the possibility of other people passing through the doors in the background. It isn't an issue in 1924, which is when this film first unfolds. But 10 years later, after Pierre comes back, Louise starts dyeing her hair, starts buying more flattering outfits, and a lot of the shots framed are looking through windows, often towards the background or beyond the camera, towards the foreground. Really living in, trying to reassure herself that she's still young and attractive, and indeed almost trying to compete with Nelly for Pierre's affections. But it's almost like a panoptical effect, really. Okay, at first, it accommodates Louise's requirement. Okay, she needs to ensure that everybody in the boarding house is paying. But as soon as she starts trying to dress differently, she becomes quite aware of this looming threat of social protocol that prohibits her desire for her son. Okay. And I particularly like this shot of her looking through the window in the door here, because on one hand, we have her looking through the window, there's a threat of visibility, but then the very rigidity of these frames really emphasise the sort of rigid social protocol that she's expected to uphold. Another reason why I really like these designs is we have a lot of these frames. Louise is constantly looking through these window frames and doors. When Nelly moves in with Pierre, okay, Pierre moves back into the home because he's absolutely broke, and he invites Nelly. When she arrives, however, all of these rigid lines, not exactly right angles, okay, but a marked contrast with this shot of the three characters, Nelly, Pierre, and Louise, walking up the stairs. Elzesser and Noel Smith's shared emphasis on the emotional excesses embedded in the melodramatic mode of expression is particularly pertinent in the case of stairs, which, according to Ben McCann's study of French set design, act as the symbolic spine of the house and signal, quote, a passage into a private and entirely prohibited realm. Feyder harnesses the expressivity of these angles to convey the disruptive force represented by Nelly. After Nelly, persuading Pierre, decides to move in, these right angles are entirely eschewed by a striking Dutch tilt. This shot suggests that the arrival of the object of Pierre's affections, far from offering a temporary narrative resolution, precludes the restoration of social order to the home. Rather, the dynamics of the home are held in tension by the incompatibility of Louise's love for her son with Pierre's desire for Nelly. Okay. What makes Louise such a complex character? Well, I've already mentioned that she starts dyeing her hair, wearing more flattering outfits. Okay, it reaches a certain point where she's wearing this ridiculous get-up here. Okay, but what I do want to point out is that there is, on one hand, she is clearly trying to at least compete with Nelly for Pierre's affections, but on the other hand, this longing for Pierre is also informed by a very strong sense of maternal protectiveness. Okay. There's a point here where she's guiding Nelly around the home, okay, and she decides to show her two pictures. The first is of Pierre as a child, and she stands quite defensively in front of the picture as Nelly looks at it. But on the other hand, she's also willing to show Nelly this picture. Louise shows this picture of herself when she was once an actress, okay, and kind of adding more depth to this sort of performative practice that Louise is affecting throughout the film. But it's actually, we're never really quite sure whether Louise is primarily motivated by a romantic longing for Pierre or by her sense her instincts as a mother. But I think it is interesting in the final scene, even in the final scene after Pierre has poisoned himself, after Nelly has left the home, there's this sort of ethereal light, okay, low-key light on his face, as though he's existing as this sort of composite of his degraded self and his mother's projections of him as a child. She still imagines that he's this innocent character. The fact is that Louise, she's putting all these pictures around the house and reminding herself of how innocent Pierre once was, but he was developing a gambling addiction as a child, okay? But this emphasis on her attempt to recapture his childhood state runs throughout the narrative. And there's this interesting parallel, the last random slide I'll show, then I just want to show a clip before closing. I mentioned she was developing a gambling addiction as a child. When she catches him with a little roulette table, she slaps him brilliantly across the face, but then consoles him. And this exact same, there's a shot mirroring this in sort of Pieta-esque gesture here as she finds Pierre stealing money from her office in an attempt to pay off his debts. I just want to show one clip from this here. Here we go. Okay, so by now Nelly has left the house, Pierre has poisoned himself, and here's Louise with her husband. She tells him to leave, and of course she walks over to him. So even there, we're still not entirely sure whether or not whether this kiss responds to her own desire for Pierre, her own sexual desire for Pierre, or if it simply responds to her own sense of maternal duty, trying to grant her son his dying wish. To close, my question really is, what is this film trying to say about contemporary French society? I'm just going to skip some of that, I realise I'm near the end now. What I do want to put, so yes, rather than, it's not, rather than trying to say it's some critique of incestuous relationships in contemporary French society, what I'm trying to do is simply to contextualise her desires, Louise's desires, within contemporary tendencies in French cinema. Bertrand Cellier observed that the Oedipal model observed earlier of older men of father figures winning the hearts, or the hands at least, of young women from other younger men, that this framework reflected what they call, I don't have a comment there, but a psychosocial paradigm in real life in which women were reduced to objects of exchange among men in French society. And in the 1930s, women in France were not allowed to vote, had limited access to capital, and the short-lived Popular Front government did little to improve the participation of women in French politics, despite granting many more rights for working class communities. So I would propose that Louise, through her nostalgia for the lost symbolic home and her romantic desire for Pierre, corresponds with Christine Bledthel's analysis of the woman in melodrama as a generator of female discourses drawn from the social realities of women's lives, discourses which negotiate a space within and sometimes resist patriarchal domination. The film does not attempt to explicitly reflect social mores in contemporary France, but its refreshingly sympathetic exploration of an aging woman's sexual desire courageously rejects a narrative paradigm that provided the existing French patriarchal order with a crucial axis of subject construction. because it opens up a space that contemporary French cinema had largely sealed off, Pension Mimosas may well be as historically relevant to its cultural context as Renoir's canonical chronicles of the 1930s. Before closing, I think I said to conclude there, but I lied. I just want to take us back to one quote from this, after a Feyder retrospective in 1951, Michel Maillet, one of the lesser known critics of Cahiers, wrote, "But Pension Mimosas, this wholesome sea of perfect film, etc., astonishing in its quality, confirms that Feyder comes first place in French cinema." I don't necessarily agree with that, but that was 4 years before Truffaut's decision to skewer Feyder, like so many other directors, and it's a pity that Truffaut had a more lasting impact. But I hope just to have shown today that an re-examination of Feyder's broader work, paying more attention to gender perhaps rather than consistency and formal qualities, is worthwhile. Thank you.